In 2021, a team of geologists analyzing deep penetrating radar data from the Greenland ice sheet published findings that received almost no attention outside a narrow circle of specialist journals. Buried beneath more than 2 miles of ice in a region that has been frozen for at least 2.5 million years, the radar return showed a circular formation of extraordinary scale. The object or formation, or whatever you choose to call it depending on your framework for interpreting what you're about to hear, measured over 300 miles in diameter. It rose from the bedrock substrate in a shape that the researchers described in their own published language as consistent with a dome structure formed by ancient biological or geological processes. 300 miles wide, buried under 2 miles of ice, older than almost anything visible on the surface of this planet. Older than the current configuration of the continents. Older than most of what we recognize as the natural world. And then the paper was published, cited 9 times, and the mainstream conversation moved on. Before we go further into what that formation might be, what its dimensions mean in context, and why the official explanation raises as many questions as it answers, let us establish something about scale. The largest surface feature in Greenland visible above the ice is a coastal mountain range that barely clears 12,000 feet. The formation beneath the ice at the center of this story has a base diameter that would stretch from New York City to Chicago with miles to spare in both directions. If you stood at its center, its edge would be beyond the horizon in every direction. No mountain on this continent, no mountain on any continent, has a base footprint that approaches what the radar data shows buried down there. And the researchers who found it did not argue with any of that. They published the dimensions. They described the structure. What they did not do was ask the question that those dimensions demand. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now telling me where in the world you are watching from. I want to see how far this is reaching. And if you are new here, hit subscribe, because what we do here every week is follow the physical evidence wherever it leads, regardless of where the institutional framework wants it to go. To understand why that question matters more than the official framework allows, you have to understand what petrification actually is and what conditions produce it at scale. Petrification is a process of mineral replacement. Organic material, most commonly wood, but in documented cases, also bone, shell, and other biological structures, is gradually infiltrated by mineral-rich groundwater. The original organic molecules are replaced slowly by silica or calcium carbonate or iron compounds, molecule by molecule, preserving the physical structure while replacing its chemistry entirely. The result is a stone that holds the shape of the living thing it replaced with extraordinary fidelity down to the cellular level in well-preserved specimens. We have petrified trees in the American Southwest whose trunks are 200 feet long and 9 feet in diameter. We have petrified logs in Patagonia as long as city blocks. We have petrified forests in places that are now barren rock, where the climate and the biological life were once so different that the current landscape bears no relationship to the one that produced the trees now lying fossilized across it. Every one of these specimens tells the same story. The Earth we are looking at is not the Earth that produced these things. The world that grew these trees is gone, replaced by a world so different that it takes deliberate scientific effort to connect the two. Now, take that principle and apply it to the Greenland Formation. The official geological explanation for what the radar data shows is a phenomenon called a subglacial bedrock anomaly produced by ancient tectonic compression and volcanic upwelling. The idea is that the shape in the bedrock reflects geological forces acting over millions of years beneath the accumulating ice. This is a reasonable hypothesis. It is also, when you examine the specific geometry of the formation in the published data, a hypothesis that requires ancient tectonic and volcanic activity to have produced a radially symmetric dome structure of almost perfect circularity, which is not what those processes typically produce. Tectonic compression produces ridges and faults and irregular surface deformation. Volcanic upwelling produces cones and calderas and rift structures. Neither process typically produces a circular dome formation 300 miles in diameter, with consistent radial symmetry measurable in every direction from its center. The biological alternative, the one that the Tartarian framework asks you to consider, is that the formation is a petrified biological structure of a scale that our current understanding of biological history has no category for. Not a tree in the way we understand trees. Something much older, growing under conditions that no longer exist anywhere on Earth according to the timeline we have been given. A world operating under physical parameters so different from our own that the organisms inhabiting it achieved scales that current biology would classify as impossible. The Tartarian tradition of historical inquiry begins from a different premise than conventional geology. It begins from the observation that the physical evidence on and beneath the surface of this planet contains structures and formations and objects that do not fit the timeline we have been taught to accept. Not because scientists are lying necessarily, but because the timeline itself was constructed from a specific set of assumptions about what was possible, and those assumptions may have been wrong from the beginning. The standard geological timeline places the glaciation of Greenland at approximately 2.5 million years ago, though ice cores suggest that portions of the island experienced ice cover and recession multiple times over a much longer period, reaching back tens of millions of years. Before the glaciation, Greenland was not a frozen wasteland. This is not alternative history. It is orthodox paleontology. Fossilized plant material recovered from Greenland sediment cores has been documented by mainstream scientists for decades. Pollen records, leaf impressions, and compressed wood fragments recovered from beneath the ice sheet tell us clearly that the island once supported forests under conditions that were warm and biologically productive by any current standard. But the Tartarian framework pushes on this further than mainstream science is willing to go. It asks, what if the biological history of this planet before the freeze was not merely different in climate and species composition, but fundamentally different in scale? What if the organisms that grew on the pre-glaciation Earth were operating under physical conditions, gravitational constants, atmospheric pressures, and electromagnetic environments that permitted biological growth at scales we now consider impossible? This is not arbitrary speculation. It comes from a convergence of anomalous physical evidence accumulating from multiple independent sources. The sediment cores of Greenland are not just a record of ancient forests. They are a record of ancient forests that grew at high latitudes under conditions that produced in some documented samples tree material of a diameter and density that no modern tree species approaches. The compressed organic matter in some Greenland cores is so uniformly dense and so extensive in its lateral distribution that the forest that produced it must have been of a biomass productivity that has no analogue in the modern world. These are not interpretations, they are raw data that conventional paleobotany works with every day, explaining them in terms of slightly different climate conditions and slightly different species while declining to draw the larger conclusion that the scale difference itself demands. Now bring the radar formation back into this context. A biological structure 300 miles in diameter is not a tree as we understand a tree, but it may be comprehensible as the base remnant, the mineralized root complex, or the basal stump of a living thing that operated at a scale proportional to the world it inhabited. A world where the electromagnetic field of the Earth interacted differently with biological growth processes. A world where atmospheric pressure was substantially higher and oxygen concentration was richer, conditions that some researchers connect to documented evidence of hyperbaric effects on biological tissue growth rates. A world where the ratio between the planet's mass and its surface gravity, which may not have been the constant that current physics assumes, permitted cellular structures to achieve scales that our current models would not allow. The geometry of the Greenland formation is instructive in another way that the official explanation does not address. When you examine the radar cross-sections published in the original paper, the formation does not present the irregular profile that tectonic and volcanic geology produces. The sides of the dome structure show a consistent slope angle that is characteristic in smaller documented specimens of biological growth radiating outward from a central point. The radial symmetry is measurable and consistent across the published data transects, and the substrate immediately surrounding the formation shows a pattern of mineral distribution that is more consistent with large-scale mineralization of an organic structure than with the cooling and crystallization of upwelled volcanic material. None of this is proof. The researchers who published the original data did not claim it was a biological structure, but they described its geometry in terms that their own geological framework struggles to fully explain, and then they moved on because the implications of the alternative explanation are sufficiently large that pursuing them requires a willingness to question premises that geological science has treated as settled for generations. The question of what else might be buried under Greenland is the one that this formation opens most dramatically. The Greenland ice sheet covers approximately 660,000 square miles. The data that produced the formation discovery came from a survey corridor representing a small fraction of that total area. What the unsurveyed portions of the bedrock contain is, in a strictly empirical sense, unknown. The Tartarian research tradition has catalogued numerous anomalous formations identifiable in Greenland satellite data and aerial photography. These include regularly spaced depressions that some researchers interpret as the remnants of ancient structures buried by successive ice accumulation, linear surface features whose orientation and spacing suggest non-geological arrangement, and several additional dome formations of smaller but still extraordinary scale that have received even less attention than the primary 300-mile structure. The pattern, if it is a pattern, suggests not a single anomaly, but a landscape of anomalies. A bedrock surface that looks to those willing to examine it without the preloaded institutional framework less like what geological processes produce and more like what a heavily modified, long-frozen biological and possibly inhabited landscape would look like after millions of years of ice loading and compression. This is where the Tartarian framework connects the Greenland evidence to its broader argument. The core claim is not simply that large biological structures once existed, it is that the world that produced those structures was an inhabited world, that the beings who inhabited it left physical traces that are still present in the geological record, and that the institutional scientific framework has, whether by design or by the internal logic of its own assumptions, consistently interpreted those traces in ways that exclude the possibility of a pre-conventional civilization of significant technical and biological sophistication. The ice core records tell us that portions of Greenland experienced ice-free conditions as recently as 400,000 years ago during documented interglacial periods. They tell us that the freezing and retreat of the ice sheet has not been a single continuous event, but a cycle of advance and withdrawal that left multiple windows during which a surface civilization could have existed, developed, and been subsequently buried by the returning ice. Consider what it would mean if the Greenland formation is what the Tartarian framework proposes. Not a volcanic anomaly, not a random geological artifact, but the petrified base of a living structure that grew to 300 miles in diameter under conditions that no longer exist. In a world that ended when the ice came and covered everything that had been alive there, it would mean that the biological history of this planet contains a chapter that our current science has no language for. A chapter in which the scale of life was so far beyond what we observe today that the specimens remaining from it, buried under miles of ice or compressed into sediment layers, look to our instruments like geological formations rather than what they actually are. The 300-mile formation is still down there. The ice covering it is still 2 miles deep. The researchers who found it have published their data and returned to other projects. The paper sits in its journal with its 9 citations and its carefully geological language and its measurements that, if you read them without the official framework already installed in your thinking, describe something that has never been adequately explained. What grew to 300 miles wide beneath the ice of Greenland? What world produced it? And why is that question not being asked by the institutions that have the equipment to answer it? Drop a comment right now. Tell me where you are watching from and tell me what you want us to examine next. Every week we take the physical evidence seriously without requiring you to accept the institutional conclusions that came packaged with it. The ice has kept this buried for millions of years. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We are just getting started.